I read an interesting quote recently. You can basically have infinite market cap or value if you don't have any product, right? It's purely on here's the dream and you're selling into the dream. The minute you release that product, you obviously have certain KPIs that you're going to be measured against.
For more on the market's action, let's bring in Anthony Georgiades, General Partner at Innovating Capital and co-founder at Pastel Network. Anthony, how's it going?
It's great. A lot of exciting stuff happening right now for sure.
Yeah, Bitcoin has surpassed that all-time high number, sitting over $70,000 this morning, like I just said. What are you watching? Where are you hoping to see Bitcoin go next?
There's a lot of key factors driving a ton of this volume right now. Obviously, last week we saw Powell with the reaffirmation that there was going to be continued cuts this year. So with more certainty and obviously a little bit looser monetary policy, it enables a lot of this risk on appetite right now. And that's obviously fueled a lot of the price velocity and speculation in digital assets, some of the meme coins, etc. In tandem with that, there is continued institutional interest that's just piling into the Bitcoin ETF inflows. And that's left itself to higher speculation around obviously the Ethereum ETF, which may or may not be just a couple months away. People have pretty much priced that in with a very high degree of certainty. I would say that I am a little bit more skeptical with respect to Ethereum ETF getting full approval on a spot basis. But then again, the market seems to have pretty high confidence in that right now. Obviously, you have other metrics like the halving that's around the corner, and that tends to be historically somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Whether or not fundamentally the halving impact of the post-halving Bitcoin supply should be a driver of price velocity today, given the fact that we know what's happening and it should be priced in. The market seems to pretty much see a 60-day pre-halving, 60-day post-halving cycle impact where we see a lot of inflow in terms of demand.
Where do you think the price of Bitcoin is heading post-halving?
So historic cycles would tell you that we'll continue to see price velocity anywhere from 60 to 180 days post-halving. I tend to think that this particular halving cycle happens really in the midst of a variety of factors, such as a lot of the monetary policy changes, the institutional changes and drivers that we really haven't necessarily had surround one of these happening events in the past. So I wouldn't necessarily speculate or trade based off of previous cycles. The long-term outlook for Bitcoin is continuing to grow stronger every single day. We at Innovating Capital aren't short-term speculators on any specific price movement. We're very much so long-term investors in the ecosystem of Web3 and digital assets. That being said, I do think that there is an opportunity to take on certain trades right now, particularly given a lot of the momentum that we're seeing.
Do you have a long-term price target for Bitcoin?
A long-term price target? Listen, I wouldn't be surprised if Bitcoin is in the millions in my lifetime. From our perspective, as I mentioned, obviously with Metcalfe's law and things like that, there is certain characteristics with respect to sufficient decentralization and limited supply that's around Bitcoin as a perfect asset in a lot of ways that we haven't necessarily seen. People call it digital gold, very different than gold for a lot of reasons. But from our perspective, there is still significant upside in Bitcoin and quote unquote limited downside.
I want to talk about some of your insights from where you sit at Innovating Capital in just a second, but I want to draw on something that you just said. You said you're skeptical about the spot ETH, the ETFs. Why are you skeptical about those?
Let me rephrase. What I would say is I don't necessarily have 99.9% certainty that it's going to be approved as the broader market seems to be pricing in. And it goes back to some of those characteristics of Bitcoin being sufficiently decentralized that Ethereum doesn't necessarily have at this point in time. It's been clear from certain regulatory and legislative bodies that, post the proof of stake upgrade, ETH 2.0, certain aspects of Ethereum were captured with respect to self-staking and some of the key staking providers, such as Lido and Coinbase. with those players that control a sufficient amount of effectively validators on the network itself, there are certain characteristics of Ethereum that could be viewed as under control of certain key centralized entities. Without those key characteristics of being sufficiently decentralized, there's a lot of questions with regards to how it should be tagged as a full utility, commodity, security potentially. And I think until there's much more clarity in terms of how the SEC and FinCEN are really going to classify Ethereum, I would say it would be challenging to see a Ethereum ETF full-fledged spot-based approved in the very short term.
Let's talk about your work at Innovating Capital now. What kind of projects are you seeing getting attention in this cycle?
Obviously, you touched on some, from the broader market, the really three key areas that people are looking at. There's obviously a lot of meme coins, a lot of AI, and there's really a ton of infrastructure scaling at the moment. We're obviously not necessarily focused on, the former of meme coins, but it is interesting to kind of see a lot of that activity moving back into the network. People view that as being, quote unquote, a bubble indicator or a froth indicator. I don't necessarily have that same conviction. I view it as it's a little bit more of retail stability and reinvigorated interest in the ecosystem, which is great to see, especially post the fallouts of 2021 and 2022. From our perspective, we're very, very early investors in a variety of layer 1 and layer 2 solutions. We are operating validators in the space, providing on-chain governance for a lot of different ecosystems and projects. In certain instances, we're market makers on various DEX-based ecosystems. I'm excited about a lot of the infrastructure level innovation we're seeing right now, app-specific chains, certain scaling solutions. There's still a ton of innovation to be had. Obviously, it's not the hottest or coolest area to talk about, but from my perspective, there's a ton of on-chain and interoperable solutions that we're continuing to deploy capital in and are very excited about. And from our perspective, that is really the future of Web3.
I want to ask you about those AI tokens. I believe that they also reached an all-time high recently. Is it because of interest in these projects, or is this more a bet on the larger AI narrative? And the reason I ask you this is I don't really see a connection between the projects whose tokens are pumping and the projects that are getting spoken about a lot in the media that are causing the tokens to pump. So tell me a little bit more about what you're watching in the AI token space.
Listen, there's certainly certain bubble attributes of what's happening in AI, different from what I mentioned on the meme coins. The AI coins themselves, and you kind of touched on it. There's a little bit of disparity between the coins that are seeing a lot of price appreciation and some of the fundamentals in the market itself. I read an interesting quote recently, you can basically have infinite market cap or value if you don't have any product, right? It's purely on, here's the dream, and you're selling into the dream. The minute you release that product, you obviously have certain KPIs that you're going to be measured against, certain performance metrics. Think about a public stock that's going through obviously quarter to quarter reviews and earnings reports and things like that. It's very heavily scrutinized. Right now, there are a lot of AI projects that have really pitched on this narrative of being the next decentralized LLM solution or whatever you might have, right? And so I think that there's a lot of excitement around what the future holds and a ton of speculation with regards to AI tokens right now, which I am somewhat weary on. But to your point, on the flip side, we are also seeing a lot of innovation in certain projects that are really delivering on certain of these decentralized characteristics, whether it's being able to be a training model data storage provider or having basically on-chain LLM self-hosting in a decentralized ecosystem. And we're excited about a lot of these prospects and projects, and we're actively invested in a handful of these areas. You mentioned obviously being a co-founder of Pastel. Pastel is doing a lot in the AI space. So it is somewhat exciting, but also cautiously optimistic with regards to where you invest. It's important to really understand the fundamentals and drivers of projects that you're deploying capital into.
Anthony, thanks so much for joining the show.
Thanks for having me.
That was general partner at Innovating Capital and co-founder of Pastel Network, Anthony Georgiades. That's it for today's show.